My parents demanded I give my sister half my inheritance after she stole from them. When I refused, they insulted my kids. Last year, my husband and I experienced a devastating loss when his parents, both 35, tragically passed away in a car accident. Their deaths left us not only with deep sorrow but also a substantial inheritance, which was divided among me, my husband, and our 2 children, our 7-year-old daughter and 5-year-old son. My father-in-law had built a successful business, and my mother-in-law was a dedicated lawyer. Throughout their lives, they were incredibly frugal, saving every penny they could. Since my husband and I already earn enough to live comfortably, we decided that the best way to use this money was to secure our children's future, particularly their education. However, when my parents found out about the inheritance, they had entirely different ideas. They learned about it at my in-laws' funeral, and as soon as the last guest had left, they pulled me aside. Without hesitation, they demanded that I split the inheritance in half with my older sister, Clara, who was 37. According to them, she desperately needed a break after her disastrous divorce but couldn't afford one because she was unemployed. Their reasoning? As her sister, it was my duty to fund her vacation. Growing up, Clara was always the golden child. She was a straight-A student, involved in every competition, and she won just about everything she participated in. She had countless friends and was the pride and joy of our parents. Meanwhile, I kept to myself. I was also a straight-A student, but I never really cared about accolades or competitions. What did hurt, though, was how blatantly our parents favored Clara over me. Before she was born, my mother had suffered 3 miscarriages, and doctors warned her that she might never carry a child to term. But then Clara came along, her miracle baby. She was everything they had hoped for, and by the time I arrived, it was as if they had already gotten their perfect child. I spent my childhood constantly comparing myself to her, believing that if I could just be more like her, maybe my parents would love me as much. But no matter what I did, it never seemed to be enough. If I got the highest grade in class, they barely reacted with a casual good job. But if Clara so much as received a participation certificate, they would frame it and display it proudly around the house. Eventually, I accepted that I would never be their favorite, so I stopped trying and focused on myself. Clara, of course, continued to shine. She graduated as valedictorian and got accepted into an Ivy League university. After earning her degree, she and her boyfriend started a business together, funded entirely by our parents. But the moment she started making money, she cut them off completely. She moved in with her boyfriend, and just like that, she was gone. For years, we had no idea where she lived, what she did, or even who her boyfriend was. She never called, never sent a letter, nothing. Our parents were absolutely shattered. The daughter they had put on a pedestal had abandoned them without a second thought. At first, they were in complete denial, refusing to believe she had truly left them behind. Then, they simply acted as if nothing had ever happened. 2 years later, Clara suddenly returned. Our parents were ecstatic until she revealed the real reason she came back. She needed more money for her business and promised to pay them back. Eager to have her in their lives again, they handed over way more than she even asked for. She took the money, and the very next day, she was gone again. For the next 15 years, we only heard vague things about Clara, but she never once reached out to us. Then, out of nowhere, she showed up at our parents' doorstep. They were stunned but welcomed her back instantly. She told them everything that had happened over the years, how she had married her boyfriend, how their business initially flourished but eventually collapsed, and how they both ended up unemployed. Over time, she and her husband drifted apart. He started spending his nights drinking at bars with friends, and she, feeling lonely and neglected, cheated on him with one of those very friends. This, of course, led to a messy divorce and a whole lot of drama. Now, completely broke, jobless, and homeless, she had nowhere to go. So, naturally, she expected to move back in with our parents. Without a moment's hesitation, they welcomed her back with open arms, despite the fact that she had ignored them for over a decade. Fast forward to my in-laws' funeral, and my parents, who had always put Clara first, expected me to hand over half of our inheritance so she could take a vacation and recover from her difficult divorce. I laughed in their faces and flat out refused. I told them that every penny of that money was for my children's future, and if they had a problem with that, well, that was just too bad. My mother lost it. She screamed at me, saying that I owed them for raising me, that they had cared for me all my life, and that if I didn't give Clara the money, they would cut me and my family off completely. And they did. Honestly, I didn't care about losing them. What did make me sad, though, was knowing that my children loved their grandparents and would now be missing out on that relationship. But there was nothing I could do. About 6 months after all this happened, I got a phone call from my mother. I had a feeling it was about Clara, so I didn't bother answering. The next day, my father called. Now, that was unusual. He never called unless it was a serious emergency. So I picked up. The moment I answered, he immediately started talking about how Clara had gotten a new boyfriend, taken a huge sum of money from them, and disappeared again. She had been gone for 2 months with no contact. Now, he and my mother wanted to meet for lunch to apologize for cutting me off. He went on and on, trying to convince me to let them back into our lives, but I had absolutely no interest in rekindling that relationship. I let him finish his speech, then told him plainly that there was no place for them in my life anymore, and I hung up. Clara always leaves, then comes back, then leaves again. It's her cycle. And the only time my parents seem to care about me and my family is when she's not around. Whenever Clara disappears, this is always the pattern. Our parents fall apart, and I'm left picking up the pieces. I've always been the one to support them, the one who's there when their beloved daughter betrays them, takes their money, and vanishes. But I can't do it anymore. I'm done. At the same time, though, I can't shake this nagging guilt, like I'm abandoning them the way Clara always has. It's a terrible feeling. I don't know if shutting them out completely is the right thing to do, but I also feel like it's the only way to protect my own peace. I'm stuck in this constant back and forth, questioning whether I'm making the right choice. Update 1. It's been a month since my father reached out, trying to convince me to let them back into our lives. I was clear with him I didn't want them in my life anymore, but that hasn't stopped them from reaching out repeatedly. I've ignored their calls and messages, but now they've shifted their focus to my husband. Almost every day, they call him, hoping he'll listen. They insist they're genuinely sorry for cutting us off and want a second chance. My husband doesn't support them at all, but he's a kind man, and he feels a little sorry for them. So, whenever he has the patience for it, he hears them out. We've talked about it a lot, and I told him that I've been having second thoughts. Not necessarily because I miss them, but because I keep wondering if I'm making the right choice. He was firm in his response. He reminded me that if I feel this strongly about it, I shouldn't let guilt sway my decision. My parents, of course, are playing the sentimental card. They tell me they miss me, that I was the only daughter who truly cared for them, that they regret neglecting me as a child, and they want to make up for it. But I don't believe a word of it. I know exactly how this goes. The moment Clara walks back into their lives, I'll be forgotten again. If they had genuinely wanted to fix things, they would have done it when it actually mattered. It's too late now. At this point, I want nothing to do with them. My kids have been a little upset about not seeing their grandparents, and I can tell they're trying to understand that something went wrong. I don't want to stop them from having a relationship with my parents in the future if they choose to, but for now, I need this distance. I need to process everything and figure out what's next. Update 2. It's been nearly 4 months since my parents first reached out, and even though my husband eventually stopped answering their calls, they never gave up. Every time they called, my kids would ask why we weren't visiting Grandma and Grandpa anymore, and honestly, I never knew how to answer them. Eventually, I broke down and picked up my mother's call. The moment I answered, I could hear her crying. She struggled to catch her breath before telling me how much she missed me and the kids. Something about her voice, the raw emotion, made me feel bad for her. So, I agreed to meet them for lunch at a restaurant nearby. The next day, I sat across from them, prepared for a meltdown, yelling, blaming, guilt-tripping. But instead, they were almost too nice. I'd never seen them act so sweet toward me before. It caught me off guard. My father was the first to speak. He apologized, really apologized. He admitted that he had neglected me and that he should have been a better father. My mother, on the other hand, barely spoke, which was completely out of character for her. All she said was that she was sorry for everything and that she should have prioritized me more. The rest of the meal was painfully awkward. They kept acting overly warm and friendly, but every bit of it felt forced. It didn't feel real. And no matter how sincere their words sounded, I couldn't shake the feeling that the moment Clara reappeared, they would go right back to forgetting I existed. By the time we finished eating, they asked if I would reconsider letting them back into my life. I told them no. They didn't argue, didn't try to guilt-trip me, didn't even say much after that. They just left. And I walked away really hoping that this would finally be the end of it, that I could finally live a life without the constant drama of my parents and my sister. Update 3. It's been a month since I had lunch with my parents and told them I wasn't interested in rebuilding our relationship. At the time, they seemed to accept it. But I should have known better. What they actually heard was, if you try hard enough, I'll eventually let you back in. They've been relentless, calling me, calling my husband, using new phone numbers when we block them. It's exhausting. Finally, I had enough. I picked up my mother's call and told her, once and for all, that I was not interested in having them in my life right now. I told her I needed space, time to think, and that if and when I was ready to talk, I would reach out. But until then, they needed to leave me alone. Unless it was a real emergency, I didn't want to hear from them. I also made one thing very clear. I warned her that if they kept harassing me and my family, I would file a restraining order. That, finally, seemed to get through to them. The calls stopped. My kids don't even ask about them anymore. I think, in their own way, they've understood that something changed. And honestly, I think I've finally understood it, too. I used to get upset whenever my kids talked about my parents, so they eventually stopped bringing them up. The truth is, I do miss them. They're my parents, and I spent so much of my life around them. But at the same time, I'm exhausted from always being the one they discard. I think I deserve a family that genuinely loves me, not one that only turns to me when it benefits them. Maybe someday, we'll be able to talk again, but right now, I'm just not ready. I need space. A lot of it. About my relationship with Clara. A lot of people have asked if I was ever close to my sister. The answer is no, not really. But that doesn't mean I didn't want to be. Growing up, she was this larger-than-life figure to me. In my eyes, she was perfect. I admired her so much that I copied everything she did. If she liked a certain band, I liked them too. If she wore a certain style, I tried to dress the same way. For the longest time, I thought she was amazing. But she never saw me the same way. In fact, I think she resented me. She went out of her way to make me feel awful about myself. If I was ever happy or even just content, she was there to tear me down. She reminded me constantly that I was ugly, that my acne was disgusting, that I was unpopular, and that I would never measure up to her. Whenever I told my mom what Clara had said, she would just laugh it off. "Oh, she's just being your sister. She doesn't mean it. She's joking." Maybe she was joking. Maybe that's just how siblings act. But it hurt. How was I supposed to ignore the fact that the person I idolized, the person I looked up to, was always the one making me feel worthless? Still, I might have been able to brush it all aside. But then, she did something I could never forgive. She kissed my first boyfriend. I was 14 when I had my first real boyfriend, and Clara was 16. One day, he came over while she was home. I left the room for just a few minutes to grab something from the kitchen, and when I came back, they were making out on the couch. I was furious with him, of course. But the real heartbreak? That came from Clara. Why would she do that to her own sister? And it didn't stop there. Anytime I liked a boy, she had to have him. Every time I got a boyfriend, she flirted with him, sometimes openly, sometimes subtly, but always enough to make me feel like I was losing. Over time, all the love and admiration I had for her dissolved. In its place, I was left with nothing but anger, disappointment, and resentment. So, when she started making a mess of her own life, it never shocked me. Update 4. It's been 3 weeks since I last spoke to my mother, and honestly, I was naive to think she'd understand what emergency only meant. Last night, right as my family was about to sit down for dinner, the doorbell rang. We weren't expecting anyone, so my husband got up to check. A few seconds later, he called out to me. I walked to the door, and there they were, my parents, standing beside Clara. My father held a bottle of wine, my mother carried food, and Clara just stood there, grinning like she had won something. My mother was practically bursting with excitement. "Clara's back," she announced, like it was the best news in the world. I just stood there, frozen, trying to process what was happening. Before I could say a word, they invited themselves in and headed straight to the dining room. I followed them, still in shock, and found my parents hugging my kids. My children looked visibly uncomfortable, unsure of what to do. I stepped in, gently took my kids upstairs, and told them to play for a while. I promised I'd bring them down for dinner soon, but for now, I needed to deal with this mess. When I got back downstairs, I found my parents and Clara making themselves comfortable at our dining table, acting as if nothing had happened, as if they hadn't just forced themselves into my home. I took a deep breath and asked, "What the hell do you think you're doing?" They blinked at me like I was speaking a foreign language. "What do you mean?" they said, all wide-eyed innocence. "Clara's back." That was their answer to everything. It took every ounce of restraint I had not to scream. The reality was, Clara had stolen from them. She had abandoned them 3 times. And yet, here they were, pretending like none of it mattered, like she had done nothing wrong. If Clara saw a guy on the street and decided he was cute, she wouldn't think twice about robbing him blind and running off. She was the definition of a flight risk. But my parents? They were still completely blind to it. She was their miracle child. Their golden girl. The daughter who could do no wrong. And once again, they were ready to ignore everything for her. They went on and on about how Clara had finally found true love again, this time with a married man. Apparently, he had promised to leave his wife and build a life with her. She had moved in with him, covered all the rent using our parents' money, of course, while he spent most of his time with his actual wife. Eventually, she got bored. So she cheated on him with another guy. That didn't work out either, so she moved in with her new fling, who at least had a stable job. But, predictably, she got bored again. This time, she cheated on him with his younger brother. When he found out, he kicked her out. So, naturally, she ran back to our parents. And naturally, they welcomed her with open arms. No matter what she did, no matter how many times she burned them, she was still their perfect little angel. The worst part? I knew how this story would end. Clara would leave again. It was inevitable. And when she did, my parents would be shattered, just like before. The only difference? This time, I wouldn't be there to pick up the pieces. This whole situation made one thing painfully clear: this cycle would never end. There was no way to fix it, no way to make them see the truth. The only thing I could do was keep myself and my family out of it. At this point, I stopped trying to be nice. I looked at them and asked, "What exactly do you expect from me?" They just stared at me, confused, acting like nothing had happened. As if this was all normal. I was beyond exhausted. My family hadn't even been able to sit down for dinner because of their intrusion, and I just wanted them gone. I didn't care if it was humiliating for them or if they felt offended. I was done. So, I told them to get out of my house. Desperate to make them leave, I even promised them something I never intended to follow through on. I said I would meet them at their house for lunch whenever they wanted. That seemed to satisfy them. My father smiled and said I should come over next week. I agreed, just so they would leave. And finally, they did. Update 5. Hey, everyone. I went to my parents' house for lunch 2 days ago. I needed some time to process everything before I could even talk about it. Dragging myself there felt like a chore, but I forced myself to go. When I arrived, I sat down in the living room, and, of course, Clara sat directly across from me. It was awkward. No one said a word. After what felt like forever, my mother walked in and told us lunch was ready. We all moved to the dining table, and my father made small talk, asking about my husband, my kids, my job. I answered as little as possible. For a few minutes, we ate in silence. And then, just as I expected, my mother got to the real reason they had invited me over. The inheritance. That was what this was all about. The reason they had been calling, harassing, and bothering me for nearly a year now wasn't out of love or guilt. It was about money. They demanded that I hand over half of the inheritance to Clara, their golden child. According to them, she deserved that money. She had been through hell, and the only way to make her feel better was to give her half of it. I reminded them again that the inheritance was for my kids. It was set aside for their future, their education, and whatever else they needed as they grew up. I also made it clear that Clara did not deserve a single cent. She hadn't even known my in-laws, so why should she get anything from their hard-earned money? My mother dismissed my words with a wave of her hand. "It doesn't matter," she said. "She doesn't need to know them to get the money." I clenched my jaw, trying to stay calm. I repeated again that the money was for my children. It wasn't for Clara, it wasn't for my parents, and it wasn't up for discussion. My husband and I were keeping it for our kids, for their schools, colleges, and their future. And that's when my mother said something that completely shattered any last shred of patience I had. She scoffed and said, "You're just going to waste it on your kids." They couldn't pour water out of a boot if the instructions were on the heel. That was it. I snapped. My kids had adored their grandparents. They had loved them. And this is what their grandparents thought of them? Up until that moment, I had still held on to the tiniest possibility that maybe, just maybe, we could reconcile someday. But that comment? That insult about my children? That crossed every boundary I had left. I lost it. I screamed at all of them. I called out my parents for being the absolute worst. I laid out every single thing I had ever bottled up: their favoritism, their constant dismissal of me, their endless excuses for Clara. I told them how it felt growing up knowing I would never be good enough for them, how Clara was allowed to get away with everything, while I was blamed for things I didn't even do. I was sobbing at this point, completely overwhelmed. And then I left. I drove straight home, blocked them from everywhere, and for the first time in my life, I felt free. They haven't tried to reach out since. And I really, really hope it stays that way. Because I don't know what I'll do if they show up again. Update 6. Hi again. It's been a couple of weeks, and I finally had time to cool off. I had hoped or prayed that my parents would stay away this time. But, of course, they didn't. They showed up at my house again last week. This time, it was just my parents, no Clara. They weren't all happy and cheerful like before. They looked miserable. And I instantly knew what had happened. Clara left again. And just like that, they needed their backup daughter. Unfortunately for them, the backup daughter was no longer available. I didn't let them inside. Instead, I stepped out onto the front porch and closed the door behind me, making sure they had no way of getting near my kids. I asked them what they wanted. My mother, tears streaming down her face, started rambling about how their perfect daughter had left them again. I think she expected me to be shocked, to be heartbroken for them. But I laughed. I laughed because, really, what did they expect? Clara always leaves. That's what she does. My mother didn't like my reaction one bit. She snapped, her grief turning into rage, and started screaming at me right there on the porch. Then, she did something I'll never forget. She blamed me for Clara leaving. I stared at her. "What do you mean?" I asked, though I already knew the ridiculous answer coming my way. She wiped her face, sniffled, and said, "If you had just given her half the inheritance, let her have her much-needed break, she would still be here. We would be a happy family." That made me laugh even harder. I looked her dead in the eye and asked, "Do you really think Clara would have stayed? Do you honestly believe she would have used that money to help you? Because anyone with half a brain could tell you that she would have taken it and disappeared, just like she always does." My mother didn't like that answer either. She screamed louder, her words a mix of sobs and blame. But I had nothing left to say. I was done. My father stood there the entire time, wearing a sad, defeated expression. He didn't say a single word, just kept staring at the ground as my mother ranted and raved. But then, to my surprise, he finally spoke. He said he was done waiting for Clara. He had finally realized that no matter what they did, no matter how much they gave her, she was never going to stay. Every time she found a new man, she ran off with him, and he was done taking her back. Then he admitted something I had long suspected: he had only ever let her return because my mother begged him to. Every time Clara came crawling back, my mother reminded him that she was their firstborn, the child who had made them parents. But I didn't believe a word of it. Even if that was the truth, he had never once seemed reluctant to welcome Clara back. Every time she returned, he looked thrilled. And he never, not once, tried to stop my mother from demanding that I give up half the inheritance for her. I told him exactly that. I told him I didn't believe him. He looked disappointed. But honestly, how was I supposed to believe him? If he had really felt this way all along, why had he never spoken up? Why hadn't he defended me? Why hadn't he been a father to me instead of just standing on the sidelines? After everything, after all of this, they still had the nerve to ask if they could see my kids one last time before they left. That was never going to happen. Not after what they had said about them. I calmly but firmly told them no. Then, I told them I would be filing a restraining order against them. I had given them time. I had waited and hoped they would finally understand. I had wanted to avoid taking such drastic steps. But they had left me no choice. The paperwork has already been filed, and for the first time in years, I feel like a massive weight has been lifted off my shoulders. I won't lie, there is sadness in this. It's painful to finally close the door on them for good. But I have had enough. This was the only way to protect my peace and finally bring true freedom to my family.